So good afternoon or good morning to everyone, depending on from where you're joining us today. Welcome to our webinar on the CDP-WWF updated version of the temperature scoring methodology. This methodology is a joint effort of CDP and WWF, and both organizations are hosting today's webinar. After a brief welcome session, we will kick off the webinar with a short introduction into the CDP-WWF temperature scoring methodology. We will then deep dive into the different steps of the methodology and highlight changes compared to the previous version of this method. We then are very pleased to have one financial institution and one real economy case study to present to you, namely by the asset manager Schroders and one on the personal care company L'Oréal. Finally, we'll close the session with a short recap of the project timeline and the expected outlook before rolling then into the Q&A session. So we want to make sure that you have the opportunity to ask your questions throughout this webinar. So as said previously, please do so and use the Q&A function to this end, which you can find in the meeting toolbar. Before introducing today's panel, we would like to get a better understanding of the audience today. So my colleague Peter will share some poll questions, actually 2 poll questions that we would like you to answer, and that should now appear on your screen. In case you don't see that, you can find the poll question in the chat where you can answer them directly as well. I just give a few seconds to folks to fill out the survey. So right now we see quite a few financial institutions and non-profit organizations in the top ranking. Thank you very much. You can still answer these poll questions. They are live in the chat. Maybe let's go to the next one. It is around your familiarity level with the temperature scoring methodology, and it should appear on your screen now. So most people, I know that's changing fast. So it seems that more people have heard about it or at least read parts of the methodology. Great. Thank you to everyone to answer the poll questions. Now I'm delighted to introduce you to the 4 expert speakers of today. So firstly, we have Donald Linderud, who will start by introducing us to the concept of temperature scores. Donald is a senior project manager for sustainable finance at WWF Sweden. In the past, he was involved in developing the Science-Based Targets Initiative framework for finance and this ITR method as a member of the SBTI for 4.5 years. Also, he has an extensive background in asset management and product development for ESG solutions. We are then joined by Helene Prokodin-Gorski, talking us through the benchmarking creation step of the methodology. Helene has been at CDP for 2 years. She's an expert in sustainable finance policies, including taxonomies, corporate disclosure rules, and prudential requirements. Her role at CDP is to help financial institutions adopt and implement sustainable finance tools, and she is also currently a member of the EU platform on sustainable finance. Also from CDP, we have Victor Verhaag today with us, who will talk us through the different steps of the scoring protocol. As Senior Product Specialist at CDP, Victor has been working for over 2 years on CDP's temperature scoring product. More broadly, Victor focuses on developing methodologies that enhance the insights derived from raw CDP data, particularly for CDP's capital market stakeholders, with a special emphasis on emission performance, energy consumption, transition plans, and targets. Last but certainly not least, we are happy to have Jenny Mill from Schroders with us today. Jenny is a climate change strategist at Schroders, and she will talk us through Schroders' experience with the temperature scores. My name is Leonida Fickinger. I'm a senior advisor on sustainable finance at WWF Germany, and I will be your moderator for this session. And with this, I'm very pleased to hand you straight over to our first speaker, which is Donald.
Thank you very much, Leonie. So welcome everyone. I'm going to take you an intro to the temperature scoring methodology first. And the first question is, why should we use temperature scores in the first place? Well, we use it for many reasons, but one is to understand your scope 3 emissions and to be able to set targets for value chain and financial portfolio for financial portfolios, and to inform engagement and portfolio and value chain construction. The problem here is that a lot of companies in our portfolio and value chains come from different sectors, and they use very different timeframes and scopes and metrics when they set their own targets. And this creates challenges for us to understand and compare companies. And it also makes it then more difficult for us to set meaningful targets for our own scope 3. And to that end, it makes it also difficult to engage with the value chain and portfolio company constituents. So the answer to this is to use temperature scores, because that translates all of these diverse GHG reduction targets into one comparable and intuitive metric. So this work started back in 2019, 2020, when we were looking for a third methodology within the Science-Based Targets Initiative for the financial institutions framework. We had the SDA, the sectorial decarbonization approach, and we had the portfolio coverage approach, but none of them were really enough for enable financial institutions to set targets for their whole portfolio of emissions, because the SDA didn't have enough sectors and available, and the portfolio coverage did cover a lot of companies. There were only about 400 companies that had SBTi validated targets at that point. So we thought, why don't we look at all the other companies that have actually set targets publicly, because there were something like 4,000 in the marketplace at that point, and we tried to score them from a quantitative perspective instead, like a mini SBTi if you want. So and there were a number of black box proprietary solutions in the marketplace then, but we wanted something that was open source, data agnostic, and very importantly, something that was a workflow solution and not a compliance tool. We wanted this to be used for your daily decision making, whether that is sort of negotiating with a new supplier, or whether that is deciding to shift your allocations and selections in your portfolio. So in addition to obviously meeting these objectives, we also introduced a warming function, which is essentially a portfolio of scenarios. So the very simple analogy is that instead of putting all your pension into NVIDIA shares, we put it into the MSCI World. And the thinking here is that we don't really know which scenario is going to pan out. So therefore, we take a portfolio approach to scenarios. It's not quite that simple, but that'll do for now. And Ellen will talk you through a little bit more about that. And then we get one comparable metric for this, and which is now available from a number of data providers. There is also a tool, a Python-based open source tool from WWF that you can use in order to calculate these scores yourself. So to sum up, some of the use cases here are to assess and compare the ambition of companies' targets, to analyze and inform our engagement activities with portfolio and value chain companies, to analyze investment and lending decisions also. So it's important to understand what the temperature scores are and what they are not. They are not a way to summarize a company's green credentials, nor are they providing insights to whether a company's transition plans are credible or not. But what it does do is to say that company A's targets implies an annual reduction rate that is consistent with an ambition heading towards X degrees Celsius, under the assumption that all other companies behave the same way. And that's quite important. So in this development between CDP and WWF, which has been ongoing now on and off since 2019. We have essentially two sets of outputs. One is the methodology document and the R code that is driving the warming function, and the other, which is what we are doing the joint development on. And the other is what I mentioned before, the Python-based ITR tool, where you can calculate your scores yourself. And from WWF and from CDP, they produce proprietary data solutions. Essentially, you can buy ready-made scores from them. With that, I'll hand over to Elaine, who will take you a little bit deeper into the workings of our methodology.
Thank you, Donald, and hi, everyone. So the objective of this section is to give everyone a bit of an overview of the different steps that we follow in the methodology, and then highlight some of the key changes compared to the first version. So in a nutshell, there are three main steps in the methodology, which hasn't really changed in the first version. Step number one is what we call benchmark creation. And in this step, we are leveraging the scenario database of IPCC to establish a relationship between a given variable, such as GHG emissions, and the associated long-term temperature outcomes. Once we establish those benchmarks, we can start looking at corporate targets themselves. So step two is what we call corporate scoring. And this is a very important step because it provides practical solutions to challenges that Donald highlighted that comes with assessing corporate emission targets in general. So we have a validation step within that company level scoring, which basically is about having a minimum of quality of disclosures associated with targets so that they can be considered. And then the second step really aims at rationalizing and summarizing the wealth of information into scope level and entity level temperature scores. Finally, as we are trying to provide a tool for in particular the financial sector, we also propose different ways in which we can aggregate those company level scores in the third step, which is called portfolio scoring. So now I'm going to spend a few minutes on step one, and then I will hand over to Victor to walk you through the second step. So benchmark creation. As mentioned before, in this step, we are basically leveraging the latest science available in terms of model scenarios that are available in the IPCC scenario database. That was the biggest update compared to the previous version of the methodology, where we basically upgraded our scenario database using the latest AR6, so the sixth assessment report of the IPCC published in 2022. And the previous version of the methodology was relying on the scenarios used in SR15, which is the special report for 1.5 published in 2018. And of course, this change induced changes in the benchmarks, which was to be expected. Models have been updated, economic models, but also climate models. There's also a new set of scenarios derived from shared socioeconomic pathways, which is a change from the RCPs, which are representative concentration pathways that were used previously in AR5 and SR15. And there's a very simple observation, but that matters quite a lot, is that in the initial scenario database, there were around 400 scenarios available, which now increased to approximately 1,200 vetted scenarios, so that means three times more scenarios. Vetting, just to clarify, is the process that consists in verifying the quality of the data within scenarios that is run by IPCC. So basically, the base of our benchmarks is these 1,200 scenarios vetted by the IPCC in AR6. There were additional filters that were applied in the previous version of the methodology, and we conducted a lot of research and analysis to assess the impact of applying similar filters on this new set of scenarios, and the results were not conclusive. So basically, we refrained against applying any sort of normative filters in this version of the methodology. Now, as part of those scenarios, there are many variables available. So the variables we are interested in this methodology are basically GHG emissions, also called Kyoto gases in our context, and we also go a bit more granular. So we are using CO2 emissions from industrial processes, from energy supply, and some activity variables like GDP or secondary energy supply to construct intensity benchmarks, as we'll go over in a second. And of course, the other key output variable is the temperature above pre-industrial levels that are implied by a given scenario and emissions trajectory. And essentially, the approach we take to create the benchmarks is fairly simple. So we run linear regression models between those input variables like GHG emissions against the projected long-term temperature outcomes. And the idea is really to establish a relationship between change in emission levels and global warming using this base of scenarios. And as Donald referred to earlier, this is called a warming function. So there is one regression per variable, so it's not a multivariate regression model. And we also run it on 3 different time horizons. So we want to understand how changes in emissions level in the next 5 years, 10 years, 30 years relate to a given temperature outcome. And this is really following the logic that we might need a sharper decrease of emissions in the near term, and we want to incentivize companies to set near-term or mid-term targets in priority and act quickly. So you can see on the left-hand side a sort of visual representation where we have the 5 variables, 3 time horizon. That means 15 regression models. Not all of them are used for the same purpose. They are essentially mapped to the appropriate time horizon of corporate targets, and different benchmarks are associated with different sectors or scopes. So for example, the CO2 from energy supply benchmark is going to be used for companies in the power sector, but also it's going to be used to benchmark the scope 2 emissions of companies, because those emissions are essentially about electricity, heat, and other secondary energy sources that are consumed by the company. So that's it for the presentation, the overview of step 1. Now I'll hand over to Victor to cover step 2.
Thanks a lot, and hi everyone. Just a quick reminder for late joiners that you can use the Q&A function in Teams to ask your questions, and we will address them at the end of the presentation. So now that we've created our benchmarks in step 1, we can move on to ambition assessments at the company level. And that is step 2 under the methodology. And obviously the input that we will be relying on for this step are the GHG emissions reduction targets that are disclosed by companies. If you take another look at the flowchart here, you can see that this step 2 is composed of 2 sub-steps. The first one, target validation, aimed at defining what constitutes a valid target and what to do with invalid ones, and also what to do with companies that did not report any target at all. The second sub-step, company scoring, will focus on sorting through those valid targets and establishing a hierarchy between them and calculating temperature scores. And the rationale for having such a detailed protocol is that companies often set several targets across different timeframes and scope components, and therefore we need a very clear process to filter them, aggregate them, and arrive at a single company temperature scores. Before diving into these 2 sub-steps individually, it might be helpful to have an overview of the whole process covered by this step 2. And that's what this flow chart here attempts to do, and I hope it is readable enough for you. At the top, you have step 2A, which is fairly simple. It essentially sorts a company's targets in 2 different categories, valid targets and invalid ones. Valid targets will be further processed, and invalid ones will be assigned a default score. Then we move on to step 2B, where targets are sorted according to different timeframes, short, medium, and long term, and also according to different scope components. Then these valid targets go through a target selection waterfall that you can see here in yellow on the chart, and which we'll detail a bit later, but the ultimate goal is to end up with only 1 target per scope and per time frame, so that temperature scores can be calculated for each of the combinations that you can see in the table on the right. So that's the whole temperature scoring process in a nutshell. Now let's zoom in on those 2 sub-steps and the changes that were made in this new version, and we'll start with step 2A. The first aspect here is, of course, to make sure that the targets that we process meet a set of minimum requirements to be considered valid. Is the target still active, for example? Did the company provide base year emissions data? Can the boundary coverage be calculated, etc.? And since we're defining what constitutes a valid target, we also need to determine how invalid ones should be treated, and that's why we introduce a default temperature score here. The reason we do that is because we want to measure the alignment of a whole portfolio or a whole value chain. And that's one of the ultimate purposes of this methodology. And because not all constituents disclose targets or only report invalid ones, we need a solution to be able to provide a temperature assessment for these companies as well. Basically, the default temperature represents a business as usual trajectory. It reflects the pathway that companies are expected to follow if they continue to operate under existing policies, essentially abiding by the minimum requirements of current regulation. And actually, this was one of the important changes covered by this new version. In the same way that our benchmarks needed to be updated in step 1, the default score also needed to reflect the latest climate science. The original default score was determined by using rejections from the Climate Action Tracker. We decided to keep the same source, the same current policy scenario, and the same level of probability. And these were all last updated in December 2023 by the Climate Action Tracker. And this results in an increase of the default score from 3.2 to 3.4 degrees. Another noteworthy change is that we introduced a 1.5 temperature floor, which is something that wasn't entirely clear in the original document. There, the rationale is quite simple. The consensus remains that 1.5 is the best feasible outcome in the most optimistic of climate scenarios. So the best score that a company can get should not be below that. In terms of step 2B now, what are the key company scoring aspects? I already walked you through the scope and timeframe sorting. What's new here is that we aligned the methodology's timeframe definition with that of the SBTi. So any target year that is less than 5 years in the future will be considered short term. Anything between 5 and 10 years will be considered midterm, and anything after that will be considered long term. Another one of the key changes addressed by this new version is the target selection waterfall. We added a couple of additional criteria, and we changed the waterfall's hierarchy. Essentially, CDP and WWF had been implementing the previous waterfall for a number of years, and we had both come to the conclusion that it was not fully exhaustive nor mutually exclusive, which meant that you could typically end up with different targets, like several targets left at the end of the filtering process. So we decided to improve it to arrive at something that is a bit more functional and also fairer. So now at the top of the waterfall, we have a new criterion, which is target vintage. And here, what we want to make sure is that users rely on the most recent target data. What we mean by that is when those targets were last communicated and confirmed by the company to still be active. It's a pretty basic but important aspect, which is why it sits at the top of the waterfall. The second level is boundary coverage. With that filter, we want to make sure that we are scoring the targets that are the most representative of the company's activities. And so the higher emissions perimeter should be preferred here. Then we look at target types. Absolute benchmarks and targets are considered of higher quality under this methodology, so they override intensity targets. Then level 4, scope composition. Single scope targets are preferred over combined scope ones because it makes more sense for a company to express a differentiated ambition at the individual scope level. After that, we consider the reduction ambition as the 5th filter. At this stage, the remaining targets, if any, can be considered of good quality, so it makes sense to pick those with a higher ambition. And on the off chance that there's still more than one remaining target after that, we would pick the target with the later target here, so the most forward-looking targets within the same time frame. Going back to the remaining company scoring aspects that we did not cover yet, Another thing that the methodology establishes here is how to aggregate different temperature scores at the scope 1 and 2 and the scope 1, 2, and 3 levels. And to do that, we use an emissions weighting approach relying on current year GHG data. We also added some clarification as to the treatment of scope 3 targets, which can cover different categories and how to navigate situations where there's several of them and no headline scope 3 target to fall back to. There's also cases where financial institutions set targets across different asset classes for their portfolio, with several targets covering the same category 15. So the methodology now addresses such cases as well. And finally, the methodology also introduces a target type exception for targets set using the CDP-WWF Temperature Scoring Methodology. These targets are a very specific type of engagement targets, and as such, they cannot be scored using the main temperature scoring protocol of the methodology. And it's another aspect that the initial document was silent about, and something that we were able to address with the benefit of hindsight. So we've just walked you through the nitty-gritty of benchmark creation and our very extensive company scoring protocol. But a rather essential thing that we haven't really covered yet, and that you might be wondering about, is how are temperature scores actually calculated? Well, Hélène already explained that the regression models in step 1 establish a linear relationship between the emissions reduction of all of our climate scenarios and the temperature outcomes associated with such scenarios. These scenarios are all scattered on the example graph here. You have the emissions reduction rate on the x-axis and the temperature outcome on the y-axis. And the line that you can see here is the expression of the relationship between these two variables. And the properties of that line are summarized in the regression equation provided next to it. There is one regression equation for each regression model. And so now let's say that we have a company with a midterm target to be assessed with an economy-wide benchmark. Let's also say that the compound annual rate of reduction implied by the target is 2.3%. We use the 10-year equation of the Kyoto gases regression model. We input the company's reduction rate as the x, and which essentially amounts to checking for the corresponding value on the y-axis. So you use 2.3%, you go all the way to the line, and you go and look for the corresponding value on the y-axis, which gives you a temperature score of 1.9 degrees Celsius. And that's also what the equation would give you in that example. So that's how a temperature score is calculated in a nutshell. And this is the outcome of step 2. We can now move on to step 3, which covers how we aggregate several company level scores at the portfolio level. So Donald, over to you.
Thank you so much, Victor. So we are going to look at the portfolio scoring. So what we've done up till now, we've created the benchmarks and we've done the company scoring, but we obviously need a method to aggregate these. Here, we haven't done any changes at all in the version 1.5. All of the changes were in the previous 2 steps. So those who are familiar with what the methodology was like before, this should be familiar to you. But essentially, the portfolio scoring helps to aggregate the company scores into a temperature score for a portfolio or for a value chain. So we obviously use the same comparable metric as for companies, the temperature score, naturally. And to aggregate these, we developed 7 different weighting options. There are different pros and cons to these. And back in 2019, when we developed these 2019, 2020, I think it was, when we developed these weighting options, it was the data landscape for GHG data looked very much different to what it does today. So that reflects some of these weighting options. But you should always be able to use the weighted average temperature score methodology in maybe in some fringe case you can't, but you should be able to use that. And the further down the scale on the right-hand column here on the screen, you can see the more robust, we would say at least, that these weighting options become. So what you see with the market-owned and the enterprise-owned and the enterprise plus cash versions, the ECOTs and so on, which is a very common aggregation method that people use quite extensively, is that they are all subject to market volatility of the underlying assets. So you may end up with changes in your portfolio temperature scores that not reflected by how much emissions have actually been reduced, but how much the value of your assets in your portfolio have actually changed, which is sort of defeating the objective a little bit. So therefore, we have the assets version and the revenue version at the very bottom here, which we prefer. They both have their pros and cons. The asset one is favoring obviously asset-heavy companies, and the revenue one is favoring high-margin companies. So there is no right or wrong here, but we would still say that the bottom two are the less volatile and so on. So that's what we would like to focus on here. Jenny from Schroders will take you through how they actually use temperature scores in a portfolio context. But before doing that, I just wanted to share. So we've gone through sort of how the temperature score methodology works now, in some depth at least. So you may wonder how you can actually access this and how you can actually use it. And it is available as ready-made scores, temperature scores for companies from a number of data providers that you can see on the screen here. These are the ones that we know about, as this is an open source methodology. Anyone can use this to create their own solutions around this. So there may be others that have done so that we're not aware of. But if you rather calculate all of this yourself and want full control, full transparency, there is a Python-based tool that WWF is developing, and that was developed within the SBTi originally, but WWF has taken over that development, which is obviously an open source solution that as well. So you're more than welcome to build on that should you wish to. With that, I'll hand over to Jenny to let her explain how you use temperature scores for Schroders.
Great, thank you, Donald. Can I just check that this navigates forward?
It does, yes.
Perfect, thank you. Great, all right, well, I've been asked to reflect on how we use this methodology at Schroders, and really the kind of three main ways in which we've been using it. The first was to set our science-based targets, which we did in 2021, which I'll go into in a little bit more. But since then, we've also been using this methodology beyond just target setting. So to assess the alignment of our portfolios, assess progress over time, and then also to assess and engage individual companies on their alignment to 1.5 degree pathways. So as mentioned, we set out our science-based targets in 2021, and those covered our scope 1 and 2 operational emissions, but importantly, as a financial institution, we had to cover our scope 3 emissions, which include our portfolio investments. We've included, and I've got a link here to our climate transition action plan. It sets out all our targets, and there's a bit of detail on the right-hand side there, but you can see that for our portfolios, we have set targets using the temperature alignment methodology. So 2.2 degrees by 2030 and 1.5 degrees by 2040. And the idea is that by setting temperature alignment targets, that should help us to make sure that we're on track roughly towards our ultimate goal, which is net zero emissions, portfolio emissions by 2050. We followed SBTi guidance on target setting, which offered several options for financial institutions to set targets, one of which is the CDP-WWF Temperature Rating Methodology. So in choosing CDP-WWF, this ensured that we were taking the steps necessary to meet our commitments under the Net Zero Asset Managers Initiative and SBTi, as I mentioned. And there's a couple of reasons why we chose this one over the other options that SBTi set out. So temperature alignment really gives you a way of having kind of consistent and intuitive scale over time to compare companies and portfolios. And importantly for us, it focuses on targets, on the forward-looking emissions, projected emissions associated with company targets. Now, some financial institutions have set targets purely on reducing financed emissions of their portfolios, but that can cause a narrow focus on the current carbon intensity of companies now, unless there are ways additionally to consider the future emissions trajectories of those companies. And that is important because we really want to be able to finance reduced emissions across the real economy, which requires us to be able to transition high emitting companies as well as low emitting companies. And temperature rating really allows us to assess how companies are going to be positioned through that transition. Additionally, and Donald and others mentioned this in terms of the methodology, it looks at targets not just like 30 years from now, it splits up into the short, the medium and the long term. And this is really useful for us to understand how companies are thinking about their transition over time and not just setting kind of long-term targets and not necessarily taking action in the interim. It also breaks down across scopes 1, 2 and 3. Again, this is really important for us to understand, are companies thinking about their operational scope 1 and 2 emissions? Are they also thinking about their value chain? And we definitely see coming through the results for individual companies that many might have set, a scope 1 and 2 target in the midterm, and maybe not so many have set a kind of scope 1, 2 and 3 target in the long term. And the methodology allows us to break that down and understand that picture across all the companies covered in the methodology in our portfolios. I'll come back to this point in a little bit, but also the methodology allows us to combine our PCAF financed emissions calculations, which is the standard for our scope 3 financed emissions calculations, into the methodology. So we'll be able to basically combine financed emissions and temperature rating. And I'll come on to why that's important in a second. And I'll just mention that Donald mentioned there's a few options in terms of looking at third-party data and running it yourself. So we monitor the progress against our targets. So we run this calculation ourselves every quarter, and we use the open source SBTi Python tool for this. And then we make the results available to all our investors internally in our net zero dashboard, which is a little screenshot of on the slide there. So our investors are able to see our temperature alignment and financed emissions for all the companies that we cover, including the portfolio alignment scores for their own funds and mandates and for Schroders Group. So this is a really useful internal mechanism for us to understand how things are progressing over time. So we run this data quarterly. And internally, we report that to our senior management and to the board. So when we set our science-based targets, we also then added a kind of group Schroders KPI associated with making progress towards the targets that we've set. So all that quarterly data at the Schroders Group level gets reported to the board, and we analyse kind of what the drivers of change are over time. And we also report our progress publicly in our annual climate report. And this is a screenshot from the latest annual climate report. So I mentioned earlier that financed emissions plays an important role, so I'll just explain why that's important. So when we're assessing portfolio alignment, the company temperature scores are weighted to aggregate at the fund level by their contribution to financed emissions. Donald mentioned that there are a few options for this. We chose financed emissions because of the close association that we have of our portfolios to ultimately reaching our net zero goal. And if we weight by financed emissions, then we're able to kind of target the biggest contributors to portfolio financed emissions, and also which have the highest temperature scores. So companies maybe that haven't yet set targets or have kind of poor ambition that are getting those higher scores. So really this enables us to really focus in and hone in on the companies that are most influencing our pathway towards net zero financed emissions. And depending on the makeup of the portfolio, we often find that top contributors are found in high emitting sectors. So those are sectors such as energy, utilities, materials. That also depends on the makeup of the portfolio, that might change. And obviously it also then depends, because it's weighted by financed emissions, on the exposure to the companies and that company's emissions. But really all of that helps us to focus in on our engagement efforts. So this is the last slide I have. And really it's important to kind of mention that when we engage companies, on their alignment, this methodology massively helps us to be able to focus in on which companies to engage and to prioritise. So across all the companies that we own, we expect companies we hold to commit to net zero, set targets and transition plans, and publish progress against their targets. And we own thousands of companies across all our investments, but the temperature alignment methodology really helps us to focus in on the companies that we should take action on first because of that contribution towards our overall group targets. And if a priority company has a poor temperature score, so poor or like low ambition or no targets, we'll engage them on their target setting, and the methodology really helps us to tell that story. If a company has a good temperature score, then we'll look to other metrics to assess and engage them on. So things like, have they set a transition plan associated with achieving those targets? How are they progressing against those targets? So we'll kind of take it a step further. And overall, the aim is to support companies to take the transition actions we want to see, from planning and committing through to real emissions reduction, which is the outcome we're really working towards. I'll pause there, and I think we'll maybe have questions towards the end, but thank you very much.
Thanks a lot, Jenny. That's really great stuff. Yeah, that was a textbook example of how a financial institution can use the methodology, and it ties in really well with what we presented before, so thank you very much for that. We now have another case study to go through, and this one will take us a bit off the beaten path. Because over the last couple of years, CDP has had discussions with L'Oréal about applying the fundamentals of the methodology to their large supplier base. Because after all, a supply chain is not so different from a portfolio when it comes to reducing Scope 3 emissions. And when we worked with them, to see how we could translate the methodology's core application to their needs. So far, this has only been a pilot project, and L'Oréal has yet to fully implement the methodology's outputs to its assessment and engagement process. But they have had access to the data for a while now, and we are working to make sure that the stars will finally align this year, and together we'll finally be able to bring the project to a more operational phase. But anyway, L'Oréal kindly agreed to contribute to this webinar and prepare this slide, which I'm very happy to share with you today. Essentially, what CDP does is that we provide L'Oréal with temperature scores for a list of about 350 strategic suppliers every year. And then these temperature scores are aggregated at the supply chain level by using emissions, spend, and supplier revenue data as weights. This is essentially an adaptation of the financed emissions weighting approach to a value chain use case. So the same kind of weighting method used by Jenny at Schroders, but applied to a supply chain. And ultimately, this allows L'Oréal to see the current level of ambition of their supply chain in an aggregated emissions weighting approach to like in an aggregated temperature score. And this is as far as we've gotten for the time being. But once we manage to accommodate L'Oréal's timing requirements with our delivery constraints, they're hoping to actively use the methodology's output to help them understand the current temperature trajectory of their supply chain and monitor their progress against the SBT that they have set for their Scope 3. And of course, the insights that they can draw from the temperature data would also help them engage more effectively with underperforming suppliers and accelerate their transition. So a very similar use case to the one that Jenny was introducing before. Taking a broader view, we are obviously hoping to learn a lot from this pilot project, and this could potentially inform methodology development in the future. And talking about future development, this is actually the broader topic that Leonie will tell you more about now, before we move on to the Q&A session. Thank you.
Yes, thanks, Victor. We will end the session with a very brief overview also of the project timeline, but then a little preview on topics that we intend to address in future updates, as Victor just alluded to. Oops, sorry. So the method that we presented today is an update to the previous version that was launched in 2020 by CDP and WWF. So the same project team then kicked off again work this year to release the current version, which is version 1.5 at the beginning of this year. We went through a very extensive public consultation process in Q2 of this year, which also included a specific advisory group for this project, and finally published the final version last week. So throughout this project, we obviously tried to integrate and address urgent needs such as the integration of the latest IPCC scenarios, but also other more general topics to enhance the meaningfulness of this method. There are, however, some limitations whose solutions didn't quite make it into this version, and that we have therefore left for future versions. And on this slide, you can just see some of these topics that we aim to address in the next 2 years when working on a future version of this methodology. So most importantly, we want to look into more granular benchmarking, so to integrate sector and industry specific warming functions, including specific default scores. We also want to find a solution to account for when a company uses carbon offsets to achieve their stated targets, and research on the possibility of using nonlinear models for a better model fit compared to the currently used linear models. So I saw there were quite a few questions on this. We have this on our radar and want to research on this in the future, but we will also give Helen the chance to talk about this in the Q&A. Other topics of interest include the potential adjustment of the temperature score when considering past performance. We also look into increasing the scope of targets that the methodology can assess today, so meaning that going beyond only greenhouse gas reduction targets, which is the case today, and potentially develop further guidance on different ways to aggregate temperature scores to the portfolio levels. So again, these are just a few topics that we aim to address. You can find a more comprehensive list in the methodology document. And with that, I will now roll into the Q&A session. So we have a good 10 minutes left for that. We had also quite a few interesting questions in the chat. One very prominent one was around the linear model, so around our choice to stick to the linear model that was also used in the first version. So maybe, Helen, you want to share some words about that?
Yeah, I think you addressed it. Certification, absolutely. And I think we kind of had this conversation in the previous webinar this morning. We are not aiming to be scientifically precise. We're also trying to ensure that our methodology can be applied on the ground. So, there's been some tests to kind of indeed switch to an exponential function or something. The actual difference is, TBD, is it worth complicating significantly an already very complex model? Where actually what we're trying to say is that the more you reduce your emission, the better it is for the long-term temperature outcome. I think this is the ultimate relationship we try to capture. But it is a fair point, and we're going to explore that further in additional research.
Thank you, Helen. There were also some other questions relating to this first step of benchmark creation. There was one addressing other variables. So the question was, why do you choose to regress against the carbon reduction rate instead of another variable, e.g. carbon intensity? Could you maybe also address that one?
Yeah. So we do. We basically have both. We have 3 sets of variables that we consider can be compared to absolute reduction targets. So in that case, you're going to look at how GHG emissions are changing through time. And then we also have additional sort of regression model where we're looking at the intensities. So that means, for example, GHG emissions out of GDP, which again is a very big proxy for economic activity, as we tend to see that a lot of companies are setting targets expressed in revenue terms, for example. So we do have a couple of benchmarks that are using those intensity metrics, but we use the similar concept. We're looking at the change in intensity, and that's what we use for the regression.
Thank you very much. There is another question around the relationship of this methodology to SBTi. So the question is, could you detail the extent to which the updated methodology is aligned with the ongoing SBTi FINS development? Methodologies appear intertwined, but it's difficult to grasp the full extent of this. Is there anyone volunteering to answer this question?
I can come in. As far as we know, this methodology should be aligned with the next version of the finance framework, the FINS framework from Science-Based Targets Initiative. We have no indications that it shouldn't be. But it's something that we will submit to the SBTi for clarification, but we have no other indication. I don't know if anyone wants to say anything about that.
I mean, maybe one could just say that SBTi, so this is obviously the second version is not developed within SBTi as was the first version. So now there's a more, let's say, official and process of accepting methodologies that obviously we will follow to submit our methodology to SBTi. And so there's another question that basically is around the flaws of ITR. So given the flaws of ITR and hence your developments of temperature scores, what do you think about the allocators asking for ITR scores and the FCA requiring ITR in TCFD reports? Is there anyone that wants to start?
I can have a go. Please fill in. That's a big question, but I mean the temperature score methodology from CDP-WWF is an ITR, an implied temperature rise methodology, and it's a fairly simple solution, and in terms of not simple, that is easy, but it explains very well the emission reduction ambition of companies, and as such, I would say that is a good thing that regulators are looking at this to get a metric that we can actually use for reporting for this. So I would favor that. If anyone else wants to come in on that question.
Yeah, I could add that ITRs have flaws, obviously, and we acknowledge them in the methodology. There's actually a whole section where we actually cover the limitations of the metric that we use. And as long as you are aware of these flaws and that you know what it does and what it doesn't do, it remains a very insightful metric if you use it knowing what it actually is. And as long as the methodology to calculate the temperature score is transparent, those limitations become much more understandable, and you can navigate them more easily as well. And when there's a black box methodology, however, that's a bit more complicated, and I think the flaws are a bit more apparent, and it's a bit more risky to use.
Thank you very much. There's one also on looking into, let's say, the ITR landscape and how we compare to other providers. So could you describe the key differences between your model and widespread temperature rating models in the financial sector, e.g. MSCI or also Bloomberg? Donald, maybe you want to start with that.
Yeah, I can start. I mean, Bloomberg is really easy because Bloomberg is using this methodology. So there is no difference. They haven't updated to this particular version just yet, but that is on the cards. I don't have an ETA on when that will happen. Other big differences, the biggest difference is probably that we use a warming function, and that all other methodologies that we are aware of, at least, use a single scenario solution. And that's quite a lengthy discussion to go into. So, and we've written a section on that in the methodology papers. So maybe we can refer to that on why. And we also had one of the universities here in Stockholm to investigate this for us, and came to the conclusion that we were indeed on the right path using the warming function. But I don't know if anyone else wants to fill in here. There are quite a few differences between our model and the others in the marketplace. Then Victor, if you.
Or maybe Jenny, I think from a financial?
I'm not going to go into every alternative methodology, but there is a good paper called the Alignment Cookbook, which goes into different types of alignment methodologies and compares, the methodologies and what they are trying to do. And I think it's always important to bear in mind the purpose of what the methodology is trying to achieve, rather than worrying too much about whether the numbers always make sense or align nicely between the two. There's always going to be slight differences depending on the approach taken.
Thank you very much. So I think we have time for one last question. There's one, does the tool take into consideration net emissions? Does a wind turbine manufacturer have a high ITR due to it being a manufacturing company, or does it take into account the emissions its product could offset? Victor, do you maybe want to?
Yeah, sure. So, as I mentioned, the input that we rely on for those temperature scores assessments are the GHG emissions reduction targets that are set by companies. And oftentimes the level of detail that we have doesn't go into this differentiation between gross emissions and net emissions. So right now we process the targets as they are, and we don't have a clear solution to address companies that might be bringing climate solutions, for example. If you think about a wind farm operator or a solar panel manufacturer, they will likely have very low emissions already, and so their targets will not reflect a very high ambition, but they are early movers. And under the methodology, they would get not a very good temperature score, and that's a limitation of the current version of the methodology, and it's something that we're hoping to address in future development, as Leonie mentioned a bit before.
I'll just add to that I think when you want to consider net emissions and the contribution that a solutions provider has, we have to be a little bit careful about. So, like, if we think about the emissions that a product could offset, you're kind of getting into the weeds of like potential scope 4 or avoided emissions, which we wouldn't normally offset with scope 1, 2, and 3. Ultimately, these are the companies that are providing solutions. So having tools and metrics that help us to identify those companies is really, really, really important. But those scope 4 emissions can't be offset from their 1, 2, and 3, which they still need to reduce. So we would still want to apply this methodology to those types of companies, whilst also being able to pull those out as this is a solutions provider. We might treat them differently. We might not engage them on this point because we want to encourage their growth. We want to, make sure that capital is reaching those solutions providers. But it's important not to make the netting with avoided emissions.
Given MSCI leadership position in ITR, do you have any color on how your relative scoring correlates to theirs? Maybe someone from the team, Donna, do you want to start responding to this?
Yeah, I can start. I mean, the methodologies are quite different. We haven't run any comparison between MSCI data for this particular version and theirs. We did run some comparisons between the old version and MSCI's, and from memory, I don't have that data very fresh in my mind, but from memory, it depends very much on the sector, and it's very important to note that there are a couple of sort of approaches that are very different between MSCI and our methodology. One is obviously the warming function, which MSCI doesn't work. I think we are the only one in the market that does that, but they rely on single scenarios instead, and that obviously has an effect on the temperature score outcome. The other one is that we consider the company and their ability to reduce emissions. So that also may have sort of impact on the on the temperature outcome for that. So it's hard to generalize how that impacts, but it's more on a sector basis. But there are certainly differences here. We would say that if we're looking at another comparative here which is sort of to the SBTI, and there are sort of ratings rather than scores. I think that we are probably more aligned with that than what we are with MSCI scores. But both of them, I mean, both of them serves the purpose of understanding the temperature potential warming of the planet given a certain company. But the other important factor is also that we only look at currently only look at companies' ambition to reduce emissions, and MSCI takes into account that and a number of other factors into that. So it's very hard to sort of give a definitive answer to that question. I don't know if anyone wants to fill in.
I mean, I can come in a little bit, Donald, just because we have looked at this at Schroders. So we look at both. We look at multiple different metrics, not just the SBTI, the CDP-WWF methodology results. I think it's important to distinguish between what the two methodologies are trying to do, and they come at it from very different angles. So with the MSCI ITR, you get one result that's applied in the long term, and it takes into account multiple different things. So it's looking at where the company is now in terms of its current emissions versus a carbon budget out to 2070. It gives you one result, and the result is also adjusted based on the actions that companies have taken. So MSCI have implemented this adjustment mechanism according to whether there's transition plans or SBTI validated targets. So it's taking into account a lot of things and giving you one result. Very useful, but serving a very different purpose. This methodology is splitting out, the ambition, the pure ambition associated with each individual target across scopes 1, 2, 3, short, medium, long, and that for us gives us a little bit more sort of detail on the relative ambition that the companies have set across those timeframes and across the scopes, and isn't taking into account the actions that the companies have taken. So we then look at the actions companies have taken in addition to the result that we get with the CDP-WWF result. So very different, and what it means is that we don't see always that the MSCI ITR result will correlate with the SBTI result or the CDP-WWF result. Generally speaking, you do see kind of trends that look similar, but not always the same because they come at it from slightly different angles.
Thank you very much, Jenny. We have another question that relates a little bit to also what I just mentioned for the future updates, meaning the default score for or sector-specific default scores. The question is, has there been any developments in regards to how companies delivering critical products, services for the net zero transition are treated in case they have no targets in place? Will they still get the default rating, which might be counterintuitive to their business model? A solar panel manufacturer with a rating of 3.4 versus an ICE manufacturer of 1.5 C, for example. Victor, maybe you want to reply to that?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Leonie. And actually, Leonie, you touched on it a little bit, but this will be the focus of future development. We haven't addressed that specific limitation yet. It is clearly a limitation that we have acknowledged in the methodology. And right now, we have no way of assessing the performance of early movers. So the typical example of a solar panel manufacturer or operator will be at a disadvantage because its ambition will likely be much smaller than that of another company that needs to achieve significant decarbonization. So yeah, we need to come up with a specific methodology for that aspect. For certain sectors, it might be quite more easy than for others. Like for the power generation sector, it might be a bit easier, but for other sectors, it's a bit more complicated. So we need to put in the right amount of research to come up with something that is fair and that we're comfortable with. But it's definitely something that we want to pick up as part of our future development for the methodology.
Just adding one flavor to that, everything that Victor says is obviously very true. The one thing that we should remember is that very few companies are without emissions. and what we are doing here is obviously looking at the emissions reductions, and that's what we are currently only considering when we're calculating the temperature score. But yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, go on.
Okay, so if does anyone want to add further to this question? Okay, good. So there was another question on green capex. Why not seek to introduce green capex in the waterfall? Aren't targets that have associated capex much more credible? Looking into credibility related to, much more credible. That was the end. So I can maybe start, and then whoever wants to jump in, because I think it also relates to future research. So obviously we are looking into like a credibility assessment. There are other providers out there that do that and integrate that also, as Jenny said. However, whether green capex should be part of let's say the assessment of the ambition, or whether this should be a more separated assessment of transition performance, is still something that we want to debate, because we don't want to mix too much, or like to have a temperature score that says more than just the ambition of a climate target. However, it's obviously true that there are things such as past performance, as we also presented in the slides, that could imply an adjustment of a temperature score. So it's definitely something that we are looking into in the future, but we're not yet sure how exactly this would be integrated. But if anyone wants to add to this.
I'd maybe just add to that in an ideal world, you would be able to associate green capex plans with individual targets, but the reality of, first of all, do we have enough information associated with each target that the company publicly reports or discloses in relation to then their green capex plans? And we're just not there yet in terms of, the data on green capex isn't great. It's improving. But I think, when we get to the point where more companies are reporting in a consistent manner the green capex associated with targets, then we can maybe look to that. But the data is just not there yet. We do look at that, but it's separate to the assessment of company ambition, particularly for this methodology as well.
Thank you, Jenny. We have time for a last question. There was one on climate sensitivity. And the question is on the relationship between temperature and greenhouse gas emissions. Have you heard of the claim made by James Hansen stating that climate sensitivity has been vastly underestimated by a factor of almost 2? I'm not sure it's been confirmed. Yeah. Is there anyone
Maybe
that...
I can...
Yes,
Maybe
thank
I
you.
can take that one. So I assume climate sensitivity here refers to some of the feedback effects that climate change essentially influences the ability of carbon sinks to store carbon. So basically, when we talk about tipping point, it tends to refer to this. So I assume that's what the question is about. I didn't hear about the claims from specifically James Hansen, but I think it's worth mentioning that most scenarios out there, whether it's IPCC or the sources, they are using a simplified version of very, very complex Earth system models. And some of those Earth system models have indeed the ability to capture this feedback effect, but their computation needs is huge. They are run out with supercomputers. There's a few of them in the world. So basically, in the scenarios, instead, you have climate emulators that are used. And so it's simplified models. So in summary, we're not trying here to be scientifically precise. Unfortunately, we're not trying to predict the future realized temperature of a given portfolio or set of targets. We're basically just trying to provide a solution to basically have a comparative analysis across corporate ambitions. So the idea is to say, something is more ambitious than another, and it helps us to kind of like go as close as possible to global objectives. But yes, indeed, it's probably not going to be scientifically precise.
Thank you very much. I would just ask Peter and Julia, who were helping me in the chat, is there anything I didn't see that should be brought up? Okay, I take that as a no. So we are about to run out of time. And with that, if there are any open questions that come up after the webinar, we're obviously always open to address your questions. So please feel free to reach out with them to us. And this leaves me with saying thank you very much to our speakers and your expertise today, and also to the audience for actively participating and asking the questions. Thank you and bye-bye.